Hi, my name is Dr. Stevie Afrati. I'm Senior Lecturer in Social Policy at the University of Wolverhampton, and this brief video is just to talk about families and how we study families as a module in its own right. So level 5 or second year we have a module on families, but we also integrate it into other modules as well. So the history of social policy, in terms of work, in terms of poverty and social exclusion, these are all areas where family structures are important. And they're important because, well, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, one of the fundamental issues is that family structures are changing. We have more diversity of family types in Britain than we ever had. So it's quite normal to have same-sex parents. It's quite normal to have lone parents, unmarried parents, parents with children from different marriages, and people are getting married later on average as well. So the structure of families as we know it has changed significantly over, well, I'd probably say certainly over the last 40 years, but probably going back before that as well. And what's really interesting, if we look at social policy from a historical perspective, certainly post-Second World War, so women had been encouraged into the workplace during the Second World War. Post-Second World War, they were encouraged to leave the workplace, and there was social policy generally, maybe implicitly, maybe explicitly, was very much based on a heterosexual married couple with the woman at home, mainly involved in childcare, and the man working. Not exclusively, there were men who didn't work and there were women who did work, and I'm not saying everyone, but that was increasingly much more the norm. Certainly in this sort of time now, that just doesn't apply. Women expect to work as much as men do, although I realise that unemployment rates are different and that types of work are different, but that very gendered, very heterosexual, very structured model of the family is something which is really disappearing. So in some respects that makes families more diverse, but also at the same time we've seen social policy take more of an explicit interest in families as well, and the way in which government interacts with families, and that's been quite important. And I'd probably say post 1997, when Tony Blair's Labour government gets elected, from then onwards, through Labour, through Coalition and Conservatives, family policy has been much more explicit and much more a key area of social policy. And possibly I think you could argue that prior to that, maybe families hadn't been studied enough in social policy. There's a rich tradition of studying families within sociology, families both as a site of patriarchy, as a site of conflict, as a way of defining gender relations, and as a way of primary socialisation as well. That's all been studied in sociology, but in social policy, I guess we were slightly behind the curve, and I would probably say that that we're now in a position where we can use some of the ideas from sociology, we can incorporate those into our analysis in social policy, and we can look at the way in which families changed and the impacts that had as well. So post 1997, Tony Blair, one of the key things that was brought in was Sure Start, for instance, a recognition that families faced a range of struggles, or at least certain families faced a range of struggles, and that if those struggles were not addressed, if the challenges those families faced were not addressed by government, then they were not going to be addressed, and we would have long-term consequences both socially and personally for the families. And so it's a role for government to intervene. Post-2010 election of Conservative-led coalition, followed by a Conservative government, we have a position where we have the Troubled Families programme instead. Very different from Sure Start, but still, we've still got a continuity in policy though, where government is engaging in family policy and is saying, we have the right to intervene here because we are picking up the pieces. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying governments never looked at families before, they clearly have. Post-1945 welfare state, early part of the 20th century liberal reforms, there's an element of family there, but it's much more explicit post 1997. And I would say that from a social policy perspective, we need to understand the differences, though, between that post-1997 Sure Start model excuse me, and that post-2010 Troubled Families Programme approach. And really it comes down to this idea of structure and agency. So when I say structure and agency, this is one of the things we look at in social policy increasingly. Structure is about those big things out there in society that, you know, we can't necessarily control. So Sure Start was very much based on the structural problems that certain neighbourhoods experience, and it was geographically focused for that reason. So from a structure perspective, as individuals, we have no control over no jobs in the areas. For instance, if you are born into an area or live in an area with no jobs, you have no control over that. If the schools are failing, if there is limited public transport, if there's bad environmental factors, all of these issues, those are beyond your control. So Sure Start very much around structure, very much around saying that we will help out. The government will step in to help out with the things that you can't do yourself. Now, I'm not saying it's entirely structural, and Tony Blair said with rights come responsibility, so you have to do your own bit, but very much based on a structural understanding. Post-2010, though, we see a very different approach to family policy, and we see an approach to family policy that's much more about agency, the role of individuals, the choices that we make, and fundamentally saying that actually the choices we make is what determines our families. Not about money, not about jobs, not about the nature of housing or availability of housing or anything like that. And this is something, you know, we can discuss as social policy academics and students. But actually saying it's about the choices that we make. And post-2010, they're saying that the underpinning of family policy is about agency. It's about the fact that you choose to engage in substance abuse, choose to run up debts, choose to be welfare dependent, and choose to fail at education. All of these things are personal choices. From an academic perspective, evidence would suggest that the Troubled Families Programme hasn't really worked, and one of the reasons I would argue is actually that there's too much emphasis placed on agency and that we choose our own outcomes and our own choices, and it's not really the case. And I think it's very tempting. It's very tempting to believe what we see on the television. So we watch programmes like, you know, starting off with programs like Benefit Street or Life on the Dole or other programs that have been described by some academics as poverty porn, where it's about us being able to watch how terrible these people are that live in poverty and the bad choices that they make and how they are awful. And we have this language around chavs and chav families and David Cameron talking about feral children, and it encourages a belief that actually these families are deeply problematic because of the choices that they have. There is something called hegemony, and hegemony is a unchallenged, often unchallenged, unevidenced set of social beliefs that we just accept unquestionably. And I would say there is a hegemony around poor families that portrays them as making bad choices, as spending their money on flat screen TVs, lager and fags rather than feeding the kids. Evidence, however, suggests that's not the case. And one of the things about studying families at university is to challenge some of those assumptions, those media-led assumptions about hegemony, and to see actually what the evidence shows us. It's a huge area, it's a very emotive area, and it's an area that actually affects all of us because we all have families, we lived in families, we have our parents, we maybe have children ourselves. We understand this from a first-hand perspective, and our role at university is to be able to study that objectively as well. So hopefully if you come to University of Wolverhampton you'll enjoy studying families as well. Thank you.